Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Riancho, and these are my wide receiver rankings for week 6. As always, these are intended for half PPR leagues, and we begin with the players who are unranked in this video due to injury and bye. Unfortunately, Nico Collins is going on IR. He'll be out for 4 weeks at minimum, and you cannot start him this week. You're also not starting Rashid Rice on IR, Marquise Brown on IR, Adam Thielen on IR, and Brandon Cooks on IR as well. All these players are out for a while, but Devontae Adams, I don't think will ever play again for the Raiders, so he's out at least this week. We'll see if the trade actually happens. Khalil Shakir, I did not rank. We'll see if he plays. It's a bit of a toss-up at the moment, but for now, I'm not sure. It's also a Monday night game, kind of risky. I'm not ranking him. Christian Watson is doubtful yet again, and I think he misses his second straight week with that ankle injury. But there's also 4 teams on bye. You can't start any of the Rams, so Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, already players who are injured, not in your lineup. Same goes with Tutu Atwell, Jordan Whittington, and Demarcus Robinson. All of them are on bye. All the Vikings are on bye, so you can't start Jefferson, Addison, or Jalen Naylor. You also can't start the Chiefs receivers, so Xavier Worthy, Juju Smith-Schuster, not ranked either. And then same goes with Miami. Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle are not in these rankings. So all of these players on the screen are not in these ranks. Let's get going with the players who are available. At number 1, I'm going with Ja'Marr Chase at the Giants, and right behind him, I have Malik Nabers versus Cincinnati. Let's start with Ja'Marr, who has quickly elevated himself to the wide receiver 1 in fantasy after a couple short weeks. In 5 games, he's averaging 18.8 points per game. That's the most among any receiver this season. 7.2 targets per game is not that much. Only 5.8 catches, 99 yards per game, though, and 5 touchdowns. He is getting it done. From an efficiency standpoint, 17 yards per catch is one of the highest in the NFL this season. So Ja'Marr Chase, we drafted him super high for a reason. He's living up to the hype. I don't know if he puts up 40 plus points every week, but I think against the Giants on Sunday night primetime, he goes off. He does not need elite volume to be the top receiver in fantasy. Right behind him, though, I have Malik Nabers versus the Bengals. And in this matchup, I think both players will be going toe-to-toe, back and forth. It will be a duel for the ages. So there is no way I am benching Malik Nabers. He is still in the concussion protocol as of this recording, but I don't expect him to miss 2 games. Assuming he plays, he's my number 2 receiver this week. In 4 games, he's averaging 18.5 points per game. He's actually the wide receiver 2 on the season in points per game. He's getting it done with volume. 13 targets per game, 8.8 catches per game, 97 yards per game, and 3 touchdowns. He's been fantastic. He's been lights out as a rookie. These 2 LSU wide receivers have been compared to each other a lot, and I'm sure Nabers wants to tell the world he's actually the better player. I expect a dogfight in primetime on Sunday night. Both of these players will go off. They're the best options this week. Number 3, though, I have CeeDee Lamb versus Detroit, and this matchup is excellent and ranks number 4. The Lions give up 36.5 points per game to wide receivers this year, 19.5 catches per game, 223 yards per game, and 3 touchdowns in 4 games. Lamb will be just fine. In 5 games this season, he hasn't been quite living up to expectation. Only 12.8 points per game, not what you signed up for. 8.2 targets per game, 5 catches per game, 83 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. Something weird is going on between him and Dak Prescott. Kind of a no-show in back-to-back second halves, but he can still light it up very easily. He went over 100 yards 2 games ago, and I expect them to play very well on offense just to try and keep up with Detroit. They're going to have to score a lot to keep up with the Lions. So excellent matchup here. I expect them to be top 5. This week, I'm not panicking on CeeDee Lamb. They get a bye after this, and especially after the bye, he'll be lights out. That's what happened last year. He came alive. He was like truly elite, averaging 24 points per game in the final 11 after last season's Week 7 bye. So don't worry about Lamb. He should be fine. Moving forward. Number 4, I have A.J. Brown versus Cleveland, who we expect to play. He has not played since Week 1 with that hamstring injury, but when he played in Week 1, he was lights out, 20.4 points, 10 targets, 5 catches, 119 yards, and a touchdown against Green Bay. He'll probably do something similar against Cleveland. This matchup ranks top 11. The Browns give up 29 points per game and 7 touchdowns so far to the wide receiver position. While Denzel Ward is kind of a tough matchup, overall, the Browns have not been that good at stopping receivers. So A.J. Brown, always a must start. Let's hope he's active. I think he will be. He's already practicing so far. So definitely starting A.J. Brown. And I'm also starting Amon-Ra St. Brown at Dallas. He's my wide receiver 5 this week. The matchup is not great. It ranks bottom 10. The Cowboys only give up 22.6 points per game. That ranks number 25 in terms of matchups. But that's not atrocious. Only 132 yards per game. 3 touchdowns to the position so far, but St. Brown is always a lock in your lineup. So far in 4 games this season, he's averaging 13.8 points per game on just under 10 targets per game, only 63 yards per game, but he was kind of bad week 1. He will bounce back, especially after the bye, fully healthy. He'll be fine. So while the usage is a little concerning regarding Jameson Williams, it still heavily favors St. Brown, and he's still their alpha number 1. Maybe Laporta gets going finally, but still I think St. Brown is a lock in your lineup. I'm not downgrading him outside the top 5 at all. I do have Jayden Reed here at number 6 though versus Arizona, and I know last week was kind of a bummer, but his upside is just too high. In 5 games this year, Jayden Reed is averaging 16.2 points per game, only 5.6 targets, but he also gets it done in the run game. 4.2 catches, 105 total yards per game this season, and 3 touchdowns. With Jordan Love, I just don't think you can ever bench him. I know last week was very strange against the Rams. It was a good matchup, and nobody really showed up other than Tucker Kraft. But this offense is really due for a big blow-up game from the jump. I think they're going to be playing well. The Cardinals don't scare you. And as long as Jordan Love is the quarterback, Reed is just a lock in your lineup. You can never really bench him with his upside. Last week, I think, was just a fluke. I'm not worried about this offense. Jayden Reed, still a top 10 play for me this week. Number 7, though. I am endorsing Deebo Samuel this week. I know last week was terrible, only 1 catch, but I think it was just the game plan of trying to get Aiyuk involved. Aiyuk actually has a very good track record against Arizona. Meanwhile, Deebo has an excellent track record against the Seahawks. In 6 career regular season games against Seattle, Deebo averages 21.8 points per game, 8.8 targets per game, 6.7 catches per game, 124 total yards per game. We know he gets some usage on the ground, and 6 touchdowns. Against Seattle, he always plays well. Even in the playoffs 2 years ago, he had 25.5 points, 9 targets, 165 total yards, and a touchdown. He will bounce back. I'm not worried about Deebo at all. I think he owns this matchup. As you look into it, he's always played well, and although he was bad last week, I expect a legit bounce back. I doubt they go 0-3 in division. On Thursday night, they're not going to fall to 2-4. I think Deebo is a big reason why. He will step up. He's averaging 10.4 points per game this season, and it's probably going to be at least 15 this week against the Seahawks. So love Deebo this week. He's top 10 for me. I don't think you can bench him despite a bad game in week 5. Number 8, though, I have Chris Godwin at New Orleans, and Godwin this season is averaging 14.6 points per game. He's still very safe. 8 targets, 6.4 catches, 78 yards per game, and 3 touchdowns this season. While he has not scored a touchdown in either of the last 2 games, Mike Evans has scored 3 in that span. I think you're still trusting Godwin no matter what. He has a 9-point floor. That's the worst he ever gives you this year, with at least 66 yards in every game. That's very safe. Evans is often shut down in this matchup as well against Lattimore. It's a very contentious rivalry, and they focus on taking out Mike Evans from the equation. So Godwin often capitalizes. In his last 5 games against New Orleans, he's averaging 14.6 points. That's exactly what he averages this season on 9.6 targets per game, 6.6 catches per game, 89 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. He's been very good against New Orleans, while Mike Evans usually plays poorly. So I trust Godwin this week. I think he will find the end zone. I think he is a top 10 play. The floor is very safe. Number 9, though, I think you're ecstatic about Drake London if you drafted him after last week. He was balls to the wall, lights out. And although he's kind of bad in this matchup historically, I don't really care. In 4 career games against the Panthers for Drake London, only averaging 5.2 points per game, 3.8 targets, 2.8 catches, 23 yards per game, and only 1 touchdown. Terrible stats from London. However, I kind of just don't give a shit. This is a top 10 matchup. This season, the Panthers allowed 29.9 points per game to the position, and they've allowed 8 touchdowns to wide receivers in 5 games. So I am not downgrading London at all. I think after last week, you are fully on board with him. On paper, it's an excellent matchup, and Cousins is playing out of his mind. While maybe he doesn't throw for 500, I still think London will approach 80, 100 yards, somewhere around there, and I don't think you're ever taking him out of your lineup at this point. Now that the chemistry is well established, I think London's a must start. Moving forward, he's inside the top 10, in a top 10 matchup. I think you're starting him no matter what. Number 10, though, I have DJ Moore versus Jacksonville, and last week was excellent. It did take a revenge game for Caleb to target him down the field, but he put up 2 touchdowns and 100-plus yards last week. Now he gets an elite matchup versus the Jags in London. They rank top 2 against the position. They've given up 38.1 points per game this season. 16 catches per game, 215 yards per game, 7 wide receiver touchdowns, and you're definitely upgrading all receivers when they face off against Jacksonville. Sometimes these games in London can be weird, however, but I think Moore has earned your trust. He has an 8-point floor in every game this season, and the matchup truly unlocks the ceiling. I don't think you're benching DJ Moore against the Jags. At number 11, I have Stefon Diggs at New England. You can argue that he should be ranked maybe top 6 with Nico Collins on IR, but Nico left the game kind of early last week, and Stefon Diggs didn't truly capitalize. He did not score a touchdown. He gave you 80 yards, but you expected a bit more given the circumstance. So that's my only hesitation. I'm a little worried that with all this extra attention, Diggs looks kind of more like the receiver he was last year in Buffalo, especially at the end of the season. We remember he was kind of brutal. However, he's clearly the number 1 target for CJ Stroud in this offense. So that's saying something. It definitely makes him a must start, and I don't think you can ever bench him. But in 5 games this year, he's averaging 13.2 points per game. That's pretty good. On the back of 3 touchdowns, however, he's been more of a check down option, averaging just over 10 yards per catch. So he could be better. You're obviously starting him, though. I'm not convinced he's top 10 this week, but at number 11, I don't think anyone is benching Stefon Diggs while Nico Collins is out. At number 12, a player who's always in your lineup is DeVonta Smith versus Cleveland. This matchup ranks top 11 this season. The Browns have allowed 7 touchdowns to the position so far this year. DeVonta in 3 games this season is averaging 13.5 points per game on 9.3 targets per game, 7 catches per game, 80 yards per game, and a touchdown. However, some of these stats are skewed because A.J. Brown was not in the field. So the volume might tick down, but still the upside is always there for DeVonta. He's still a must start every single week, and he is expected to return from his concussion. I doubt it keeps him out for the 4th week overall. So he's not going to see much Denzel Ward coverage this week, and in this matchup, he gets an upgrade overall. There are no worries with Mr. Smith this week. Number 13, I have Terry McLaurin at Baltimore, and on paper, this is actually the best matchup so far. It is a bit skewed by the 4 touchdowns last week to the Bengals receivers, but still the Ravens have had a very leaky secondary this season. They're good against the run, but bad through the air. They've allowed 38.5 points per game to wide receivers this year. 14 catches per game, 209 yards per game, 9 touchdowns to the position, although 4 did just happen last week. So maybe McLaurin isn't Jamar Chase level excellent, but I still think he's getting a solid upgrade this week. And while his first 2 games were pretty bad, he's either had 100+ yards or a touchdown, if not both of those, in each of the last 3 games. He's really come alive in this offense the last 3 weeks with Jayden Daniels. So I trust him. He has a 10.4 point average this season, and with 2 touchdowns, I do think that probably turns into 3 this week. So love Terry. The upside's very high, and I don't worry about this matchup at all. It's a big upgrade. It's a regional rivalry game, and I think Jayden Daniels will play excellent. He's been compared to Lamar a lot, and I think he'll go toe-to-toe in this matchup. I definitely want to start Terry McLaurin against the Ravens. I'm also starting Marvin Harrison Jr. at Green Bay. The matchup ranks top 9. The Packers allow 31.4 points per game to receivers this season, 12 catches per game, 168 yards per game, and 7 touchdowns to the position overall. Marvin in 5 games this year is averaging 12.1 points per game, and with 4 touchdowns so far, I think you're starting him no matter what. While he has had a couple bad games, he also has some massive games, and I think you're just riding the wave no matter what this season, just taking what you can get. If you drafted him, I don't think you're ever benching the talented Marvin Harrison. So this game could be a huge shootout. Jair Alexander might miss his 3rd straight game in a row. So if that happens, you're definitely starting Harrison. There is no downgrade to worry about. Number 15, though, I have Garrett Wilson versus Buffalo, and the matchup is bottom 5. The Bills have been excellent at stopping opposing receivers, only 19.5 points per game allowed. However, we remember last year in week 1 with Zach Wilson, he had that like trapeze level circus act catch, and I wouldn't be shocked if in division he steps up again and plays very well. He's only averaging 11.2 points per game, and last week he finally broke out, but it was on the back of like 21 targets. He only turned 13 catches into 101 yards and a touchdown. Yeah, that sounds nice, but from a yards per catch standpoint, that's kind of brutal. You would expect it to be a lot higher on 13 catches. So I'm not convinced he's like truly elite yet. Obviously, you feel a lot safer starting him after last week's game, but I don't feel convinced he's top 10 at the moment. And if they do trade for Davante Adams, he will move down the list quite dramatically. So I'm worried about his value long term. I would consider trying to sell high on him because the trade for Adams feels kind of imminent to the Jets. And once that happens, you really don't know what you're getting from him. So at the moment, he kind of feels just as valuable as last year when Zach Wilson was his quarterback. And that's saying a lot. We expected a lot more production from Garrett Wilson this year, and he has not lived up to the billing. So hoping that last week is a sign of things to come, but without 20 targets, you're probably not going to go over 100 yards. That's why I only rank him at 15. Number 16, though, I have Zay Flowers versus Washington, and the matchup on paper is still really good. However, it's been trending in the wrong direction the last 2 weeks. It's actually been a lot more difficult. Still on the year, they rank as the number 6 matchup for opposing wide receivers, allowing 34.4 points per game. But if you rewind just 2 weeks ago, it was an average of like 45 points per game, and 10 points is a significant decrease overall. So it's not as safe, but they have given up 10 touchdowns to the position on the year, and that's what I'm still buying into. If this week the Ravens receivers suck against Washington, then I'm going to write it off as actually a bad matchup moving forward. But at least for one more game, I'm still considering it an upgrade. And with Flowers, he's either the focal point of the offense in the passing game, or he completely disappears. He has 10 plus targets in 3 games this season. However, 2 games with like less than 5 points. So good luck. I think the only time he burns you, though, is when he gets game scripted out of it and Derrick Henry just dominates from the opening kickoff. I think this game will be very competitive, pretty back and forth, kind of a shootout, and that means Flowers will get targeted heavily. I think he will be perfectly fine in this game. I expect him to play well and be a big part of the offense. So he's averaging 7.8 targets per game this season, and it's either like 10, 11 or less than 4. And I think this is a week where he gets heavy volume. I'm trusting Flowers. Although he only has 1 touchdown on the season, I would love to see him find the end zone more consistently. I still think he's a top 20 play in this matchup. Number 17, I have Brandon Aiyuk at Seattle, and they made an effort to get Aiyuk going last week, and it worked. 12 targets, 8 catches for 147 yards, but they did still lose. So that's not a recipe that they want to keep going. Like, if it doesn't equate to a win, why would you continue to do that all the time? I definitely think they want him to be established every week. They paid him a lot of money to do that, but the offense is probably going to look a lot more balanced in this game. Historically, Deebo plays very well in this game, so I think it's more of a Deebo matchup than an Aiyuk matchup, and he actually has really good stats against Arizona historically, so that was kind of a repeat last week. Jennings, I'm not totally convinced, has evaporated from the target share either, so it could go back and forth. I'm not convinced he's the alpha receiver in this game. I favor Deebo this week, but still after last week's performance, I think Aiyuk is back firmly in the top 20, and he's getting close to top 15. I think Aiyuk is still in your lineup this week, moving forward, he's probably a safe play. Number 18, though, in the same game, I have DK Metcalf versus San Francisco. And DK had a massive game versus the Niners in the playoffs 2 years ago, but otherwise has pretty mediocre stats. In his last 5 games against the Niners in the regular season, 8 points per game is his average on 7.4 targets, 4.2 catches for only 47 yards and only 1 touchdown in those 5 games. So nothing special. I think it is a decent downgrade, but he's been very involved this season. He's averaging 12.8 points per game with 2 touchdowns. He also has 2 fumbles though, but he's averaging 84 yards per game. I still think you're trusting Metcalf kind of no matter what, but in this matchup, I think he's closer to wide receiver 20 than wide receiver 10. Number 9, I have Diontae Johnson versus Atlanta, and I think last week's bad game was mostly just because of the Bears matchup, but obviously you're not as confident in Diontae moving forward as you were prior to last week, but he still has 33 targets, 11 per game over the last 3 weeks with Dalton at quarterback. So I still think his floor is very safe. He has an average of 14.8 points as well. And this is an average matchup. The Bears are a significant downgrade. So I still think you're starting Diontae. If he sucks this week, then I'll panic, but I'm not going to overreact to just one bad game in a terrible matchup. Jalen Johnson can shut down anyone. So I still think Diontae is worth the investment. With that type of volume, the floor is usually safe, and I think he will be a top 20 player a lot more often than not rest of season. So at number 19, I'm still starting Diontae Johnson, but it's kind of a prove it game. If he sucks again, he probably won't crack the top 25 after next week. Number 20, though, I have T. Higgins at the Giants, and I was right to rank him top 20. Last week, he had another 2-touchdown game against Baltimore. That's the 3rd time it's happened for him in his last 4 games against the Ravens. So not expecting it every week, but in 3 games this year, he is very involved in the offense. 10 targets per game, 6 catches per game, 61 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns, an average of 13.1 points, although it is kind of all skewed towards last week's performance. So I'm not expecting an elite 20+ point game every single week, but it's 2 straight games now with 10+ targets, and he's getting more volume than Jamar Chase this season. So I think he's a big part of the offense. He's not going anywhere. Joe Burrow needs to light up the scoreboard. Their defense fucking sucks. And against the Giants in prime time, I expect a high scoring game. T. Higgins will play well once again. So back inside the top 20, I think you're very excited about the volume headed his way, and if he continues to see this double-digit target share, he's a lock in your lineup every single week. He might be moving up the ranks if it continues. Number 21, though, I have Tank Dell at the Patriots, and Tank has had a very slow start to the season. Only 5.8 points per game on average in 4 games this year. 5.3 targets is nothing special. 3.3 catches for 33 yards and no touchdowns. You're not getting much from Tank, but he's about to be a must start for the next month now that Nico Collins is on IR with a hamstring injury. He basically becomes Stefon Diggs with deep threat potential. He's also due for a touchdown. I think there's a massive game looming for Dell, and it wouldn't shock me at all if he heavily outperforms Diggs in this game. So I think he's at worst a top 25 play moving forward. I think he's a excellent start with no Nico Collins. CJ Stroud will get him going, and his ceiling is just way too high to ignore. At some point, it will pay off. So I'm starting Tank Dell this week. I think with no Nico Collins, you have to. Number 22, I have Jameson Williams at Dallas, and the matchup does rank bottom 10, but I kind of don't care with JMO. It's just a question of will the deep target hit or not. He has 1 terrible game, but otherwise in his other 3 games, he's been fantastic this season, looking like a true deep threat every single week. His speed is a problem, and most defenses can't stop it. So Jameson, I think, is a very good flex play at worst this season. Top 25 kind of every week at this point. He's averaging 12.4 points per game on only 6.3 targets, 3.3 catches, but 78 yards per game is elite, and it's an average of 23.6 yards per reception for JMO. So If that hits again, you're going to be very happy. He has 2 touchdowns on the year. And while I'd still much rather have St. Brown, the fact that Laporta is still kind of struggling to perform, I think JMO is very trustworthy. I would continue to start him. His upside is undeniable. Number 23, though, you might think this ranking is a little bit too low on Brian Thomas Jr., but I really respect this matchup. The Bears rank bottom 6 against the position. They've only allowed 1 wide receiver touchdown on the year, an average of 20.5 points per game to the position. So I don't think Thomas finds the end zone this week. I think it'll probably look a lot like week 2 when he played against Denzel Ward and the Browns. He only had 2 catches, but it did turn into 94 yards. He's going to break at least 1 massive play in this game. It seems like that's inevitable every single week. However, I do not think it goes for a touchdown. I think Brian Thomas deserves a legit downgrade this week. Last week, they completely shut down Diontae Johnson, who was averaging 20 points per game the previous 2 games before that. So I do worry about anyone going up against Chicago. They have elite players in the secondary, especially Jalen Johnson, a top 3 corner, will probably limit Brian Thomas a little bit. So I don't rank him top 20. I think he's earned your trust, though. He's averaging 14 points per game this season with 3 touchdowns, 82 yards per game. I just don't think an 85-yard touchdown is something to bet on every single week. So Brian Thomas Jr. downgraded him this week, but still probably a high-end flex option. His upside is undeniable. Number 24, though, I have Darnell Mooney at the Panthers, who's been playing lights out this season. It seems like all he needed was a change of scenery. He's been excellent with Cousins. He almost had a 3rd touchdown last week as well, if not for a late drop that hit him right in the chest. He's a viable starter every single week in your lineup. He's overtaken Kyle Pitts as the number 2 option in this offense, and he's actually right on par, right on pace with Drake London in terms of targets so far. He's averaging 8 targets per game. London barely like 8.5, and Mooney's giving you 12.6 points per game on 3 touchdowns this year. I think he's a top 30 option no matter what. I think you are starting him. The matchup is also top 10. While I don't expect Kirk to throw for 500 yards every week, Mooney is a very legit flex play no matter what. Number 25, I have George Pickens at the Raiders, and Pickens still does not have a touchdown this year, but his usage is pretty decent. Pickens in 5 games is averaging 7.9 points per game. That's his floor because he has not scored a touchdown. 7.2 targets, 4.6 catches for 60 yards is at least not going to burn you. You're not going to be terribly upset with 8 points from George Pickens. But at some point, the touchdown will hit. This feels like a good matchup for it to happen. The Raiders don't scare you at all. And he also has that deep playability where he could break the door open and put up 25 plus points in any given matchup. It has not happened yet, but he could go over 100 yards easily. And if the touchdown does finally hit, then you're getting at least 14, 15 points. You'll be very happy with Pickens if that does happen. So at some point, it will work out. This is where I ranked him entering the season back in the summer, and I do think Pickens will live up to a top 25 overall player at receiver this year. He'll probably hover around 25 in the rankings every week. Number 26, though, I have Michael Pittman at Tennessee, and the matchup is actually terrible. The Titans rank as the worst matchup for receivers this year, only giving up 16.4 points per game, not a single touchdown to wide receivers in 4 games. So on paper, it's a terrible matchup against L'Jarius Sneed. I do worry about Pittman. Last week, though, he was kind of mediocre. He really bailed you out with a touchdown. Only 5 catches for 37 yards and a touchdown on 8 targets. So it could have been better. The Jags were definitely a far better matchup. But with Flacco at quarterback, you do trust Pittman a lot more. He's a much safer play. And while he's much more of just a floor play this week, he actually plays very well in his last 5 games against Tennessee. He is averaging 13.7 points per game on 10.6 targets, 7 catches for 66 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Pittman usually plays well in this matchup, but based on the season-long stats, I think it's a very legit downgrade for any player all year long, and I don't think he's a must-start. At wide receiver 26, I think he's just a flex play, more of a floor play option. I'm not dying to start him, especially if Richardson is the quarterback. He would drop at least 10-plus spots overall. So a downgrade of a matchup, not ideal. Last week was not great. Pittman, not the best play you could find, but still top 30. I'd still probably keep him in the lineup because he's kind of bust proof with Flacco at quarterback. Number 27, though, is as low as I can go on Mike Evans at New Orleans. And if you know anything about this matchup, you know that Evans does struggle against Marshawn Lattimore. In his last 10 regular season games against New Orleans, he maxes out at 4 catches for 70 yards with only 2 touchdowns overall, and usually has his worst games on the road in this matchup since 2019. In his last 5 games at New Orleans, Mike Evans only averages 6.3 points per game. That's really bad. 3.6 targets per game, 1.8 catch for 30 yards, and 2 touchdowns. The touchdowns have bailed him out, and he's still only giving you 6.3 points per game on the road at New Orleans. So I'm really worried about it. I kind of feel too high with this ranking, honestly, at 27, but he's still a player that's very likely to find the end zone. You know that role is not going to go away. So he'll probably get those targets in the end zone again, and if he does score a touchdown, you'll get close to 10. However, without it, you're going to be very desperate. You're going to be very upset with Evans in your lineup, but he's probably earned so much trust for you. I think you just can't bench him. It feels kind of blasphemous not to rank him top 30, and at 27, I'd still probably start him, but just lower the expectations. I don't think you can expect a massive blow-up game from him unless Lattimore gets hurt on like the first play of the game. Even then, I still think they'll make a point to try to take him out and force Baker to beat them without Evans. So definitely worried about it, but at wide receiver 27, he's still in the flex conversation. I still think the touchdown is a decent thing to bet on. Number 28, though, in the same matchup, I have Chris Olave versus Tampa Bay. And the matchup on paper is actually top 7. We saw Drake London, Darnell Mooney, even Ray McLeod play very well against them last week. However, Olave is going to get a backup quarterback this week. It looks very unlikely that Carr is going to play, and we're probably looking at Spencer Rattler getting the start instead. We really have no idea what to expect in that scenario. I definitely think it's better than Jake Haener at quarterback, but last week's dud was mainly a product of the Kansas City matchup. I don't expect it to be that bad. So I kind of view him identically to Evans. There is risk, but there's also a lot of upside. Olave is still very talented. However, in 4 games against Tampa Bay, just like Mike Evans, he really struggles in his career in this matchup. Only an average of 6.1 points per game, 3.3 catches for 44 yards, not a single touchdown historically against the Saints. So he deserves a downgrade for sure. I'm worried about the backup quarterback, but there is a world where Rattler plays very well and gets him the ball like crazy. I think he's still a top 30 play, but I'm lowering expectations on Olave. This week, he deserves a legit downgrade with a backup quarterback. Number 29, I have Amari Cooper at Philadelphia, and the matchup indicates you should really trust him. It ranks top 3 against the position. The Eagles allow 37.5 points per game overall to wide receivers. So it really should work out for Cooper. They've given up 8 touchdowns to the position in only 4 games this year. However, Washington was a good matchup on paper last week, and Amari Cooper did not capitalize. He only had 4 catches for 60 yards, nothing truly elite in fantasy. So I do worry about the fact that Watson is his quarterback. As long as Watson is there, you just can't really trust this offense. Cooper does have a massive blow-up game, but otherwise he's been very bad. While he is averaging 9.4 targets per game this season, he's only giving you 4 catches for 42 yards every week on average, and that's 8.6 points per game. That's nothing special, and it's pretty skewed by a massive 2-touchdown game a few weeks ago. So Amari Cooper, very risky. I don't think you have to start him, but the matchup says upgrade him. At wide receiver 29, I think he's a mid-level flex play. It's the highest I can go, though. I don't want to trust Deshaun Watson that much. Number 30, I have Rashid Shaheed versus Tampa Bay, and just like Olave, there is plenty of risk with the backup quarterback. I'm hoping for the best, but I really don't know what to expect without Derek Carr. However, Rattler should be fine, and when it comes to Shaheed's value, his role is not going to change. He's either hitting on the deep target or not, and usually the deep pass turns into a 50-yard plus touchdown. So he's rather boom bust, but this season there's only 1 game out of 5 where he has burned you. While it was a bagel, otherwise he goes over 10 points every single week. So his upside is too undeniable, too high to ignore. He has 20 plus point potential, and I don't think his role will change at all just because Rattler is the quarterback. So Shaheed is averaging 12.4 points per game. He's a very legit start every week with high upside. I still think he's a legit flex play at wide receiver 30. I'm still probably starting him against the Bucks. Number 31, though, very interesting pickup off the waiver wire. Jalen Tolbert versus Detroit, I think is legit. I'm buying into what I saw from him last week with Brandon Cooks on IR, CeeDee Lamb and Dak not quite on the same page yet. There is no real threat for his targets. Other than Jake Ferguson, who else is there to throw to? So I love Tolbert's floor. I think the touchdown viability is extremely high every single week for the Cowboys' number 2 receiver as well. Last year, we saw Brandon Cooks score 8 touchdowns, and Tolbert could do the same. So with Cooks unavailable, I think Tolbert's a very legit option. Definitely a high-end flex option off the wire. I think you're very comfortable starting him. If you need help at receiver, there's a lot of players unavailable this week with all the buys. So Tolbert, very legit. The matchup ranks top 4, and this game probably turns into a shootout. I think he'll get plenty of targets deep down the field and could score another touchdown. I think Tolbert is a legit play, just as valuable as a guy like Shaheed. I honestly want to rank him above Michael Pittman, Mike Evans. I could bump him up a legitimate 5 spots and make a case for it. Number 32, though, I have Wan'Dale Robinson versus Cincinnati, and Wan'Dale is only averaging 7.2 yards per catch this season. Last week, he caught 6 for 36 and a touchdown, but he's getting it done with volume. Wan'Dale in 5 games this year is averaging 9.4 targets per game. Not many players can say that. 6.4 catches for only 50 yards is kind of brutal, but with 2 touchdowns, an average of 10.6 points per game, the floor is there, especially in full PPR. He gains more value, and the Bengals defense cannot stop anyone. So this could be a very high scoring game. He will continue to get his checkdowns every single week. While he probably doesn't score a touchdown, it is possible, and he benefits a lot from Nabers drawing so much attention away from him. I do think Wan'Dale is a very legit flex play every week. Number 33, though, I have Josh Downs at Tennessee, and the matchup is terrible. It ranks number 32. They have not given up a single touchdown to the position this year. But even without a touchdown, Josh Downs is playing pretty well. This ranking, though, is completely dependent on Flacco getting the start. But in 2 games with Flacco, Downs is averaging 14.8 points per game on 10.5 targets, 8.5 catches, 76 yards per game, and only 1 touchdown. He is a very safe floor play no matter what. The matchup is not good, but the toughest corner will be covering Pittman, and I think he's probably worth a start as a low-end flex play as long as Flacco is the quarterback. I do still trust Downs a pretty decent amount. Downs is not a bad start at all. Number 34, I have Jakobi Meyers versus Pittsburgh, and I might still be too low on this rank, honestly, but it feels appropriate. He is a de facto number 1 wide receiver in the NFL, and to hover around 32, 35 feels about right with Jakobi Meyers, but I'm not expecting the world from Aiden O'Connell. Meyers in 2 games without Adams, though, is averaging 8.8 points per game without a touchdown. 9.5 targets, 5.5 catches, 61 yards. That's a pretty good floor. It's kind of like George Pickens. You're getting a safe, bust-proof 8 points no matter what from Jakobi. If the touchdown hits, you'll get 15 plus. So Pittsburgh is a decent matchup. They gave up 87 yards and a touchdown to Tolbert last week, another 50 to Kevontae Turpin, and Jakobi Meyers could play well here. I don't think the Steelers secondary is the biggest nightmare you could face. So I think he's in the same tier as Pickens, Michael Pittman, Mike Evans. I think wide receiver 25 through 36 are all kind of the same. I do think Christian Kirk is still a legit flex play this week, even though the matchup is bad at Chicago. It's in London, and the Jaguars usually have an advantage when they play in London. So while he was terrible the first 2 games, he now has 3 straight games with at least 10 points in fantasy, averaging 12.8 points per game the last 3 weeks. He's been very good, very high floor, and it's kind of matchup proof as well. So I don't terribly worry about the matchup. He's kind of bust proof in general, and they do have to focus a lot on Brian Thomas. I do think there will be plenty of targets available for Christian Kirk. However, Evan Ingram is expected to return, so maybe not as many, but he might also be more open as well. I think Kirk is a very legit floor play. I don't think he'll ever burn you, but I'm never expecting a massive ceiling. The touchdown rarely hits for Christian Kirk. Number 36, though, kind of the last player I think is worth a safe start this week, and even that is kind of pushing it. Calvin Ridley versus the Colts. The matchup is what I am buying into. The Colts rank top 8 against the receiver position, allowing 31.7 points per game this year 13 catches, 194 yards per game, and 5 wide receiver touchdowns makes you encouraged with the idea of starting Ridley. This offense is not one that I trust, however. I think Pollard is safe, but beyond that, it's really a gamble with any other player, and we don't know for sure who the quarterback will be this week. But whether it's Levis or Rudolph, I don't think it really matters. There's very little upside in general. It's kind of touchdown dependent for the most part, but the matchup suggests that the floor is high and that one of these players will have a good game. I still think Ridley is the wide receiver 1. He has one spike week, but otherwise only averaging 8.2 points per game this year. Off a bye, however, they should have a good game plan. And last year, he had 101 yards and a touchdown on 8 catches versus the Colts in week 1 with Jacksonville. In week 6, he fell back down to earth, only 3 catches for 40 yards, so pretty hit or miss. He deserves an upgrade, but he's never a confident play. This could be a Hopkins game. I just don't know for sure, and it might burn you. At wide receiver 36, I'm not dying to start him, but the matchup suggests he deserves an upgrade. 37 and 38, though. I have the Seahawks number 2 and 3 receivers back-to-back, and I actually prefer Tyler Lockett this week over JSN against the Niners. Lockett is getting 6.4 targets per game. JSN is getting 8, but Lockett is averaging 55 yards per game. JSN is averaging 51. So Lockett is still more efficient on similar volume. It's not that different, but he is the de facto number 3. However, while he's yet to score a touchdown, his floor is good for 7.7 points per game. He's kind of bust proof, and Lockett in his last 5 games against the Niners is averaging 10.4 points per game, only 1 touchdown, but 7.8 targets, 6.4 catches, 72 yards per game. Very high floor from Lockett in this matchup. He historically plays very well in this divisional rivalry. So I think it's a toss-up who of these 2 players has the better game, but I'm actually preferring Lockett. I am leaning towards him as the safer play this week. JSN is a guy I really want to trust, but I just can't for some reason. He has one elite game, but otherwise his max yardage is only 51 yards in the other 4 matchups. And while he did belly out with a touchdown last week, without it, you would have been pretty pissed. So I'm not expecting that to happen that often this season. The touchdowns are kind of going to be really random with Geno at quarterback, and they will usually favor the running backs in Seattle. So if Lockett was gone, I'd feel a lot better about it, but he's not. And the targets are relatively even between all 3 receivers. I definitely trust DK, but beyond that, it's kind of a toss-up which of these 2 players has the better game. So this week, I view them pretty identically, and Lockett plays well. Historically, I think he will have the better game. Then JSN on Thursday night. They're both low-end, very risky flex plays. Probably both give you around 8 or 9 points this week. Number 39, though. Now the risk really is a factor. I have Dontayvion Wicks versus Arizona here at 39. And week 5 was so disappointing. The biggest impediment to his success was playing time. He finally got it, and he puts up a dud. I was really disappointed. He cost me a win on one of my teams, and I benched Garrett Wilson for him. I was so pissed with Dontayvion Wicks. I really don't know what happened to the Packers last week. They should have scored way more points, but even Jayden Reed was bad. It was all just Tucker Kraft and Josh Jacobs. So we expect at least Romeo Doubs to return this week. So Wicks might benefit from another player on the field, less attention, but he could also burn you. It could be a Doubs game, but the upside is still far too high and enticing to dismiss. So I still rank him top 40. I'm not dying to start him, but he is firmly in the flex conversation if Watson remains out once again, and the Cardinals secondary does not scare you. I think Wicks feels very boom bust. He's playing at home this time around, though. There is a world where he pays off. Good luck if you're going to start Dontayvion Wicks. You also need some luck if you're going to start Rome Odunze versus Jacksonville. And while it is very risky to bet on a second Chicago Bears receiver while Allen is healthy, the matchup suggests Caleb is going to have a very good game. The Jags are the number 2 matchup for opposing wide receivers. They give up over 200 yards per game to the position and 7 touchdowns on the year. So it's definitely an upgrade. I'm worried about betting on anyone other than DJ Moore, honestly. It could be a Cole Kmet game as well, and it could definitely bite you in the ass. But similar to Wicks, I think the upside is undeniable and very enticing to high to ignore. And while Rome is only averaging 6.9 points per game this season, I get it if you want to bench him. He did flash that upside in week 3 when he had over 110 yards on 6 catches with a touchdown. So the upside is there. I do think a breakout game is looming for him, and it wouldn't shock me at all if he plays excellent in this London matchup right before the bye and lets everyone know I was drafted top 10 for a reason. In a standalone game, I wouldn't be shocked if he does play well. So interesting spot here. Rome is very enticing, but probably a little too risky to fully endorse. You're probably benching him, but it wouldn't shock me at all if he went off. Number 41, I have Juwan Jennings at Seattle, and Jennings only had 1 catch last week as they really tried to get Aiyuk established in the offense. He obviously could burn you again, but I'm not ready to fully give up on him. I expect a good game from Deebo here, but he also had just 1 catch as well last week, and if he can bounce back, so can Jennings. Technically, Jennings can still get involved, but he is fading for sure. Similar to Rome, there is a lot of risk here, but he has showcased his upside this season, and I'm not convinced he just disappears completely in this offense. Maybe I'm wrong, but he's still in the dart throw flex conversation for 1 more week. There is still high upside for Juwan Jennings. Now, though, I'm definitely benching all the players moving forward. I have Ladd McConkey at Denver here at 42, and the matchup is terrible. He gets Patrick Surtain this week. The Denver Broncos have only given up 1 touchdown to the position and only 108 wide receiver yards total per game. It's a very big downgrade for all of the Chargers receivers. They're not that safe plays in general. I do think McConkey is the best guy. He'll probably get another 6 targets. That's what he's averaging this season. But without the touchdown, you will get burned, and it probably does not hit. I'd rather just bench him at wide receiver 42. I'll pass on McConkey. But number 43 is another de facto number 1 wide receiver in the NFL. It's Keon Coleman at the Jets. And if Khalil Shakir does play, I will rank him lower. But if he doesn't, then you're probably going to see the most targets of any receiver for Buffalo in this matchup. But the matchup's terrible against the Jets. It ranks bottom 8, and odds are Sauce Gardner is the guy draped all over him and completely limits him to only 1 catch. That's what he gave you last week, but it was a 49-yard touchdown, and that's the only way this works out. If he finds the end zone, you'll be comfortable, but odds are the floor is very low. The ceiling is not that high. In a bad matchup like this, I'm trying to sit Keon Coleman. Number 44, though, is Courtland Sutton versus the Chargers, and I just have no faith that he's ever going to consistently pay off. He is getting double-digit targets often this year, but he's never turning it into much. This team wins with defense, and Bo Nix rarely throws touchdowns. It's not a good matchup on paper. The Chargers rank bottom 4 against the position, only allowing 19 points per game, 118 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns in 4 games. Not ideal. Sutton is only averaging 7.4 points per game as well. So really tough matchup on paper. I'm not trusting Sutton at all, and it kind of feels like Josh Reynolds could outperform him any week. I'm going to bench Sutton if I can. At number 45, though, speaking of dart throws, it feels insane to rank him here, but I have Alec Pierce at number 45 at Tennessee. He is the most valuable wide receiver for fantasy in Indianapolis this season, averaging 12.3 points per game. He has 2 games with less than 5 points, 2 games with over 20 points, and another game with 14 points. So it's a Hail Mary if you start him, but you can't dismiss his upside. He's clearly the deep threat in this offense, and it has been hitting kind of consistently. So if you're just trying to get 20 points or nothing, go and look at Alec Pierce. That's all you can ask for. In DFS, he's interesting. I'd probably not consider starting him, though. In season long, it feels too risky to expect to hit every week. Number 46, though, in the same game, I have DeAndre Hopkins versus the Colts, and the matchup is top 8. The boom-bust nature of the Titans receivers makes it too hard to trust, however, and one of them could have a good game, but you never know who it is. I think it's Ridley this week, but 2 weeks ago, neither of them played well against Miami, and it's really hard to bet on a single Titans receiver. I genuinely think Hopkins is someone you can consider dropping at this point because I never have enough confidence to rank him high enough to start. Unless Ridley gets hurt or he gets traded to, the Chiefs, what is the value with Hopkins? It's really just too risky to bet on. I am saying no thank you. Even in a plus matchup, I'm going to bench DeAndre Hopkins this week. Number 47, I have Romeo Doubs versus Arizona, and it was a very strange suspension last week. Not sure what's going on with him, but you would think he probably steps up as he's motivated to prove himself coming back onto the field. It's a pretty good matchup as well, especially without Christian Watson. There's always some opportunity, but he may have squandered it with his attitude. He's not a safe play, that's for sure, but at wide receiver 47, I could see him be the top receiver in fantasy in this offense this week. He could be much better than Dontayvion Wicks. I don't think he'll be as good as Jayden Reed, but it wouldn't shock me if he puts up like 2 touchdowns. He had 8 last year, and they're playing at home. They're probably going to put 30 plus on the scoreboard. So not the worst bet, but last week was just so weird. I don't feel comfortable rostering Romeo Doubs. Number 48, I have Xavier Legette versus the Falcons, and he did get hurt and taken out of the game last week. He is questionable at the moment, but it sounds like he'll suit up. It's hard to judge what he actually offers you in fantasy, though, after such a weird, bad game. But without a long track record of success, you can't start him yet. I still believe he's a good long-term asset with potential to emerge as their number 1 receiver and overtake Diontae by the end of the year. But with this lingering injury, he's too risky to bet on. He's on the fringe of your roster, and I would understand dropping him if you need to make the space. He has not cemented himself as a must start moving forward. Number 48, I have Quentin Johnston at Denver, and the matchup is terrible, but he is athletic enough to maybe score a touchdown. That's what he's done so far this season. However, Josh Palmer has been injured all year long, and I'm very curious to see what the target share looks like with a fully healthy Josh Palmer expected to come back off the bye. It might be a little more crowded. So maybe Palmer is more valuable than QJ, but at least so far, the stats do not prove that. You do prefer QJ over Palmer. We'll see if that repeats this week. But against the Broncos, I'd rather just bench him. Number 50, though, I got Allen Lazard versus Buffalo, and if you start him, you're just hoping for a touchdown. But Mike Williams is not established enough to worry about, and Rodgers has a fondness for his guy. They fired Saleh, so Rodgers is just probably going to continue to do whatever he wants. If they trade for Adams, then you can probably cut him, but until that happens, he's still a decent bet to score a touchdown any given week. The upside is there, but the matchup is bottom 5. I'd probably bench him and continue to do that. Moving forward, I don't trust Lazard every week. These last 10, though, I'll just rip through as players to mention. There is some upside, but I doubt it happens. At 51, I have Michael Wilson at Green Bay, who does have 22 targets over the last 3 weeks, but every time I trust him, he always burns me. However, he does have 10 plus points in 2 of those last 3 games, as mentioned. So the floor is interesting. The matchup's pretty good. Maybe he finds the end zone, but without it, you probably won't feel good about Wilson in your lineup. Number 52, though, I have Ray McLeod at Carolina, and sometimes he's more involved than Pitts in this offense. You could do a lot worse than McLeod, but too risky to bet on. I doubt it that you actually want to start him. At 53 and 54, though, I am keeping my eye on the Patriots receivers Jalen Polk and Demario Douglas this week against the Texans. Drake May gets his first start of his career. The offense could get a spark, and they are probably still terrible, but the number 1 wide receiver is up for grabs, and Polk is starting to emerge. He nearly won the game if he only dragged his foot last week on that go-ahead touchdown that could have been, but it was called out of bounds, and it did not happen. So long-term, I do prefer Polk, but for now, it's still possible that Demario Douglas holds on to the majority of targets. It's still truly up for grabs, the target share in this offense. We'll see what happens with Drake May. Hopefully, we will learn a lot from this game, and maybe one of these guys is a player you might be starting next week. Number 55, I have Keenan Allen versus Jacksonville, and I'm high on Rome this week, 15 spots higher, but honestly, the same logic can be applied to Keenan. Keenan is only averaging 2.6 points per game, though, so it's really just the matchup as the only reason to consider him. I'll pass. I'm more fond of Rome, and that might just be personal bias. But Keenan, I don't trust at all. Not going to start him this week. Number 56, I have Kevontae Turpin versus Detroit, and it's a really good matchup versus the Lions. Turpin has some speed. He had 50 yards against Pittsburgh last week, so if he sneaks into the end zone, you'll be somewhat satisfied, but he's only viable in DFS. He's more of a contrarian play than someone you trust. I would only consider Jalen Tolbert off the wire in Dallas. Number 57, I got Josh Reynolds versus the Chargers, and some weeks he looks just as good as Sutton, and this offense will rotate to different guys on a weekly basis. He could score a touchdown again, but the matchup is bad. Number 58, I have Darius Slayton versus the Bengals, and he played very well without Nabers last week. He's more of a deep threat though, so it makes sense why he's not a factor when Nabers is healthy. I think he deserves more of a role in this offense though. He's played very well in the past, and he could start to emerge if Dable wants to get him going. Number 59, I got Mike Williams versus the Bills, and he might only have one more week of top 60 value if they do trade for Devontae Adams, but I do feel like a breakout game is coming for him. He can always disappear, but eventually he'll have a great game where he looks unguardable, followed by a game where he probably gets hurt and out for the year. Rodgers still prefers Lazard though, so Mike Williams is not safe enough to start. At 59, he is too risky. Number 60, I have Andre Yoshivas, the last player I will mention. Very touchdown dependent, and T. Higgins is fully healthy now. He's getting way more targets. That pretty much craters all of Yoshivas' value. However, against the Giants, it's not a matchup that scares you. He could find another touchdown. It is possible, but I wouldn't bet on it. It feels too risky. So these are my wide receiver rankings for the week, the top 60 at the position, and I feel excellent about the top 5. But starting with Jayden Reed, moving towards Tank Dell, Jameson Williams, I think you're getting double-digit fantasy points for sure. Those are all the players I'm starting with confidence outside the top 5. They will be viable in your lineup. I would expect at least 12 plus points from them. They have decent matchups. They're playing well this season, and they've shown you at least something to trust, whether it's the situation like Tank Dell with the no Nico Collins or just the track record this year. But I think once you hit Brian Thomas at wide receiver 23, we enter the flex conversation. The matchup is really bad for some of these players, and some of their historical track records in division matchups is really bad, like Mike Evans and Chris Olave have not performed well in this spot. So there is some risk, but I think all the way through Christian Kirk, Calvin Ridley, you still feel pretty comfortable. There are reasons to trust some of these players, and I would expect at least 9-10 points from the top 36 wide receivers. They're all players I'm considering starting this week, but I think once you hit Lockett, JSN, you've hit the dart throw touchdown dependent category. So that's the cutoff point for me, but I do think all the way through Keon Coleman, Cortland Sutton, there is still like a glimmer of hope. A little touchdown dependent though for my liking, and it does get really, really disgusting once you hit DeAndre Hopkins and Alec Pierce. That's the cutoff point. Alec Pierce at 45. You're just desperate at fuck at that point, and I'd probably avoid it. So these are my receiver rankings for this week. If you enjoyed, hit that like button. That's going to be it for this video, and I will see you next time. If you have any questions, let me know in the comment section down below. I will be happy to answer them. But I'll see you next time. My name is Adam Riancho, and thank you for watching Nice and Blunt.